All right, this is episode number 13 with Ruel Mannette. He is a philosophy graduate student at the University of Hawaii.
Yep.
Perfect. All right, let's get into it. So he wrote 3 papers. They were very interesting. I read them. And the first one, memory, authenticity, and alienation. I kind of want to hear your thoughts on that, and kind of if you could explain it, that'd be cool.
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having me on here too.
No
Yeah.
problem.
So that one was just that was the one I just done recently. Um, the journal that was for it, it puts out a call for papers. It'll oftentimes they find a specific article and they're like asking different people who have a knowledge in the field to kind of respond to that article, and so that's kind of what that paper was. And the paper it's responding to was actually this really well researched, really interesting paper about the question of like, can with a memory modifying technology, this would be something that could alter what your memories are. Could that end up having a potential impact for like an ethical question? Could How important are your memories for authenticity? And in that paper, the paper I was responding to had done pulled from a large amount of the literature, especially in psychology, about questions about um, how central memory is for authenticity, like how central memory is for kind of just building a notion of like the self, how you relate to um, your past and other people and so forth. Um, and so my paper was kind of I was kind of responding to this. I thought this was a very interesting topic. I mean, obviously, authenticity is like a really fascinating question. But what I kind of saw there when I was looking at what was going on, despite all the stuff they kind of brought in, it has this kind of tendency, and this is something I've seen in like other kinds in my research as well. This tendency to kind of focus on the individual rather than focus on the context. And I think especially when you're dealing with something like so complicated as like what is it to be you? What is it to be an authentic self? I think it's really easy to just think this is always just like a you problem or maybe you and your family problem, and not to really take into account kind of like other questions and how that could impact it. And so that's kind of what that paper was just kind of doing for that discussion, was trying to introduce. Okay, if we're going to talk about a concept of authenticity, what are other kind of related concepts that could appeal to like a much broader context? For example, alienation. How can you talk about being an authentic individual if we don't really have any sort of understanding of what it would be like to be inauthentic, what it would be like to be alienated? And I think there's this kind of presumption there, especially with like authenticity, that it's just like, oh, it's just you're just inauthentic. There's not necessarily this. I guess you're just not being yourself. There's not this analysis of what kind of mechanisms or what kind of aspects of society could cause you even to be alienated. Um, and so that paper I brought out Henri Lefebvre, who's like a French like philosopher and sociologist, and Heidegger as well, who had very different perspectives on this. Heidegger's is a much more I mean he I don't even know how much Heidegger would have been totally on the in dealing with this question, but Heidegger's is much more ingrained. Like even the kind of concept of being is kind of hard with Heidegger. But like insofar as there's a they self, this kind of broader structure of other people talking, how much can that limit this kind of da sign in relation to trying to kind of unveil its truth or like kind of function in society. Um, and so I think that was one of the ones I brought up. And then Lefebvre, I think is a little bit more straightforward. Just how does like culture and society like give us ways we should be interacting that maybe aren't really that can maybe are distorting like how we would be where we would feel authentically. I don't know if that kind of answered your question, or that was kind of along the
No, no, that answers my question. Yeah, um, it's really how does because we have this device that can alter memories. How does that
sure.
relate to alienation and authenticity? And then I know in the paper you said something about how they're kind of opposites to each other, or they're complementary almost. Like if you have authenticity, then you don't have alienation.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like I think that's an interesting. It, it's at least like I feel like something you have to kind of think about when you're dealing with a concept like authenticity. Is this like how related it is to its whatever its other state would be? And I think
Hmm.
the kind of assumption is just that maybe it's just inauthentic. But like what is inauthenticity, and how much does that come from other people or other ways of behaving? Because I feel like to understand authenticity, you really kind of would have to understand what it would be like to like what is alienation, what is it to be like put in a way of being that like maybe isn't what you what would feel right, or maybe what other people want you to be in, or maybe like something that could be almost destructive to itself. um yeah.
Because that's sort of, if you're being inauthentic, then in a sense you're being alienated from yourself, right?
Yeah, I think that's, yeah, and I think that's pretty, I think that's pretty accurate. But I think it also it like has to take into account like for exactly specifically in this kind of paper, like something that would be altering your memory. um why would someone want to have their memory changed in the first place? I think that like ends up becoming a real question there. um like do you like are you doing that almost because you feel obligated to fit into certain norms in society? um
Hmm.
I mean, if that's the case, it's like then maybe this is the real question we should be dealing with about this ethical worry. Because if you were already like inauthentic to begin with, then is the memory, if is changing the memory really fixing or doing anything? I don't know.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's because if you take away your memory, or at least some of your memories, just a memory that say you want to repress that you don't want,
Yeah, yeah,
and you do that so that you can change your behavior or at least change your emotions, then are you really being yourself
yeah,
after the memory
yeah, exactly.
alteration?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And there's the question. I mean, and the original paper I brought this up that I was responding to. It's like how much does memory go into shaping the self, whereas like is and how important is it for like just kind of how we generally function, for us not maybe to have this kind of perfect memory that's always just a recording device, right? So a lot of the memory that we like kind of already, and this is a lot of psychological and neuroscientific research has already kind of gone into this, just like that are clearly our like the way our memory functions isn't like a video camera. We're not just like
Mhm.
picking up the detail of everything that's already going on. We're already kind of selectively like altering kind of for oftentimes like our own mental health and our own like stability of the organism, I guess. What we're remembering. But it's like I guess when you're going into something with where you kind of have a direct control of it outside of that, I think then that kind of adds this interesting layer for sure.
What
Because
do
then
you
it's just not.
mean this? What
Yeah,
What do you mean
like
an extra layer outside of it?
so like for example is like I was just saying, like if you're already kind of we already kind of select our memories, but we're not always conscious of it.
Hmm.
But if we had a technology where we could just change the way we were thinking about something, then we're consciously manipulating our memories. And that's
Mhm.
that's the kind of extra dimension I think is kind of fascinating here.
Yeah, I guess because if you're actively altering your memories, it's your choice to alter them rather than subconsciously doing it, then I guess that would be almost an authentic way of doing something.
Sure, but it's like what kind of social pressures too
Yeah.
is making you want to like
Hmm.
because we were already assuming that there's that the that you do have the full control over of what you're changing there, but maybe that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah.
And then
So what?
oh, sorry.
No, continue.
Well, I think the other question about, and this is why I think authenticity ends up becoming a very loaded question too, is there's a there's a, well, a philosopher from Florida. I can't remember exactly what his name was, but he was talking about, he had a book on authenticity, where he's talking about oftentimes you see it a lot in like in kind of self help culture discourse, where there's this idea that the authentic self is just this kind of pre childlike state that I'm gonna do X activity or whatever, and then I'm not. I'm somehow not this self anymore. And so all I have to do is kind of re-dig through my body and my guts to reactivate whatever this childlike state gem that's at the center of me. But like, and as this philosopher's bringing up, I mean, there's a lot of from developmental psychology, or even if you go into like as far afield as psychoanalysis, there's clearly some questions. Is like, oh, is the childlike state all that innocent? Is that really who we are? Are we not this kind of like a built up accumulation of experiences? And so that's, I feel like, just built into any sort of discussion on what the concept is of authenticity is. It's like, and that's what the original paper is really talking about. Is these questions of like essence versus kind of like a choice and accumulation uh, for who you are, who you could be.
Hmm. Yeah, essence versus choice and accumulation.
Yeah, I guess in the paper they were bringing up this kind of like this the original paper they're bringing this an essence theory, and they were bringing up like they were kind of having this very caricatured broad like Sartre's idea of that you were just this like whoever you are is like this choice that you kind of make yourself. Um, and they were trying to find this middle ground that I think is in certain ways kind of closer to Heidegger's position of that, like you kind of you get this, there are degrees of choice, but it kind of builds up over time. And that's kind of I feel like the question of authenticity they're working with there. But I feel like in a lot of popular discourse we have this kind of this essence idea, which I think is which definitely makes the whole discussion a little more complicated, but also a little more interesting. I feel like too.
So is essence kind of related to the soul, or what we deem to be our true self?
Yeah, yeah. I think that would be, I think, or at least, I mean, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong here. Or I feel like a lot of people tend to have this kind of conception of who they are, that their authentic self
Hmm.
is this kind of this almost this emanation of, let's say, a soul, or it doesn't have to necessarily be a soul. It doesn't have, but some sort of like thing that lies at the heart of us, an essence that lies at the heart of us, and that we are an expression of whatever that is. And that therefore this gets clouded over, and then we need to rediscover this. But I think, and I'm not going to say that like science says that's necessarily wrong, because I don't think science can do that. But I do think there's other discussions. There's definitely other ways in which we could exist. Like we could be because there's clearly maybe an inheritance that we seem to have, but are we also just maybe in it? Is the true us also the experiences we have
Hmm.
um, over time?
Yeah, I think, at least to me, I think the true self is that accumulation that we are talking about over time of all these experiences, um, our inheritance, right? Our genetics and all these things that kind of add up to where you are right now.
Yeah, for sure.
So I used to kind of go a lot into how naming things can impact how they're conceptualized. Like, for instance, in your second paper, the ismizing Buddha, I would
Yeah,
kind of want to hear more about that.
and then although that's yeah, that I think naming things is also pretty interesting, because yeah, because then we're kind of almost getting into this realm of language, and I think the first thing when you're in the realm of language that you kind of have to start off with discussing is how much does language kind of affect how we understand the world. I guess like there's the easy dichotomy again of like, is it this like Sapir-Whorf thing, or is it everything we think about the world has to be filtered like
Mm-hmm.
eliminably through language, or is it that oh, we have this like just pure control over it, the language is just this vehicle, it doesn't really affect anything. um, I think, and I think a lot of other people probably with me, I would be interested to hear your take, kind of probably side in this more middle area where it's like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
language does clearly color a lot of the way we see reality, but there's also ways in which things can be translatable. There are worlds that can exist kind of outside, not necessarily outside of language, but outside of like a strict kind of linguistic determinism almost, if that makes sense.
No, I agree. I mean, if you say build a house, the
Mm-hmm.
environment inside of the house is going to be different, but the outside environment is certainly going to affect the house. And that's kind
Yeah,
of how language is, right? We invented this structure, which w- within the structure, it has its own ways of acting and interacting with the world, but the world also affects it.
yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think that's like that's a good way of explaining it for sure. Because I think that yeah, I mean you kind of you can see just like based on geography, if you have some remote group living in some part of the world and they don't interact with a lot of people, their language will end up having a very different structure than say a group of people that's all constantly going, throughout the
Mm-hmm.
world. I know there's some research in linguistics about like you see that languages that tend to have a large international thing, especially a lot of the colonial languages like English or French or something, tend to have a lot of words, but much more simple grammar, much simpler grammar in relation to like some of like much rare languages in like the Amazon or like Siberia that where there's it's smaller populations, so they kind of all know each other, and they tend to have a much more complicated grammar, although the information is being conveyed grammatically rather than like vocabulary wise, because it's like they're so used to it, they're so used to each other. It's much easier to learn. If you're constantly traveling, it's much easier to learn a few words, like and have a simple grammar structure, because then it's 3 or 4 interactions to learn a new word. Where it's like if you're trying to learn a whole new grammatical change, then that can take like 10, 20, 40 interactions. Um, so it's like something. So that's why I feel like, yeah, you definitely have to take into account like just where people are. I feel like geography for sure, because I think that can really shape the language, which could in turn then really shape, to a certain extent, some perspectives of the world.
Yeah, I think, talking about this with a friend, and we were curious whether speaking different languages at birth affects the way that you think about the world.
Yeah, for sure. Um, and I think that's kind of like what the question, right, that we're kind of getting into here. Um, and yeah, I think to some extent it probably does. I would be hesitant. I would be, as I said before, I'm really hesitant to take like a strong Sapir-Whorf kind of position, because I do think that a lot of it is ultimately translatable. But
Mm-hmm.
it's I think it's more about the time it might take to translate something. So I could see a language being able to convey a very specific kind of idea, maybe in like a few sentences that might take a different language, a whole book to explain the same concept. But
Yeah.
eventually you'll be able to still get to the same idea. It's almost like I feel like a difference of degree rather than a difference of kind.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely.
But I do think that
So,
it. Oh, sorry.
oh no, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say I do think it ends up coloring a lot of it. So it's like it does require a lot of attention to kind of I feel like how we're saying things, because I think that can have a lot of like yeah philosophical import, if that makes sense.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, it's like the way that, because if you speak different languages, you'll interact with people differently. Because for one, you're speaking differently than others, and two, you were born in a different area, and three, you're probably using different kind of hand gestures and facial expressions in the way that you communicate.
Sure, sure, yeah. And then there's just like kind of almost a accumulated meaning to or associations to things, right? Um,
What do you
like
mean
we
by
can
that?
think of like we can think of like in like how do I say, like certain phrases we have like a bird in the hand is better than two birds in the bush or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't see that that's the idiom specifically, right? But it's like some of these idioms have like some, you know, some cultural weight to them, or they've been used in certain contexts, and that kind of brings up associations or memories um, that like might like, I mean, it's just idioms in general might not necessarily make a whole lot of sense like meaning wise, and like if I was to try to explain this in some other language, okay, then I'd have to kind of go through these kind of associations.
uh,
I think a big one's like rule of thumb. That's I think that's a pretty important one because that one ends up having some like political import, right? Because the rule of thumb was like this. I mean, the old law of like the stick you could beat your wife with, and so like we use this as a kind of a general term, but this has like some serious like almost sexist content. Um, it's this like idea, so it's so kind of being aware of this kind of like context. I think can have a lot of impact for your for the word. I don't know.
Dude,
That's
I had
why I
no
think that.
idea.
Yeah, no, it's one a lot of people don't know. But it's like you hear about that, you're like, oh wow, really? It's like that's not great. But yeah, I think there's a lot of that kind of stuff in sometimes the way the words we use and play with. So I think it's kind of
Wow.
important to be attentive to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably just so many words and phrases that have dark histories like that that you're
Sure.
just not even aware of.
Yeah. No, that's true too. And then there's some like where it's like that where you might not necessarily be aware of it, and then there's other ones that kind of purposely conjure it up, but you don't necessarily think about it. So like for like with we're doing this with COVID, but we do this with like other diseases too. Like um, it's like metaphors that we use to like how do we handle this. And this we did this with the war on drugs, for example, right? Or like
Mm.
this is a war on cancer. It's like the images we're conjuring up are like images of war and mobilization and army violence. Maybe it can really work for something like a disease, for example. But I remember watching like a because it can be good for motivating people to bring resources together and like get them to work together. But I remember watching like a TED Talk video about like this speaker came up there and started talking about like discovering planets as if it's like a war, and it's like I don't know if that's necessarily the way we want to be metaphorically talking about like discovery, right? That's not. I don't know if that's like the kind of the way we want to be interacting with like because I mean of all the things like discovering plants, I think is one of the things where we could be like, oh no, that's one of like the most peaceful like things we could almost do. I feel like
Yeah.
conceptually. It's just like this kind of like learning for its sake. So it's like putting it in the idiom of like a conquest. I think is definitely something we should be attentive to. Um, but I think uh, it can have repercussions for like diseases. Well, I had a friend who was doing research on like cancer and like maybe overtreatment, where it's like because of the this discourse of war and mobilization, it's like so there's sometimes they end up with more screenings that could end up causing more harm, and
Mm.
than necessarily might be the best case. Maybe it's a or then maybe people feel like they're like this battle metaphor. Well, it can like pump them up. It can like maybe someone that's no longer being able to like the fight isn't necessarily a loss because it's not really a real enemy in this kind of way.
Mm.
And so like how it could be psychologically destructive to people if they think it's always just about they always have to position themselves conceptually as this kind of warrior. And if there's this thing that's like in certain ways maybe unbeatable, it's like it's not necessarily a fair fight either. So they can have kind of that kind of metaphorical import. I feel like as well.
Yeah, especially with the war on drugs. I
Yeah,
think labeling it as the war on drugs definitely made it worse.
yeah. I think so, I think so for sure. Because then it's about fighting an opponent about conquest. It's about winning, and it's like, yeah, but did you win? Is that something you want? Is that something you can win? Like even conceptually, um, like what would victory even look like? Um, yeah, I think in certain ways it makes kind of the way you handle it violent as well, because it's like, okay, so these guys are our opponents in this kind of conquest. It's like, I don't know if
Hmm.
that's how we should be treating people, especially if it's like if you're doing some, especially with some of the hard drugs. Some of the issue here, I feel like, is definitely like questions of addiction and stuff. It's like, do you want to treat addiction like they're enemies, or should we be treating them like maybe people that need help?
Yeah, and I forgot who it was, but I was watching this video about this guy who worked as an addiction counselor, doctor for some odd 20 years, something like that. And he was
Mm-hmm.
saying how everyone who was an addict in that facility that walked through experienced trauma as a child or just sometime during their life.
Oh yeah, yeah. Oh, I think I'm familiar with who you're talking about. I can't remember his name. Mate or something. It's like, um,
Yeah, maybe. I think it was, I can't remember what ethnicity he was or from what country.
yeah, but no, I'm familiar with that as well, and it's like, and I don't know, um, and yeah, because this is getting into almost like questions of psychology. I don't necessarily know like what is, because I think his research is important, but I don't know exactly the cause of, let's say, like addiction. But like I think that is an
Hmm.
important thing to keep in mind, though, is like there could be, especially I think for a lot of these kind of addictions, there could be this kind of like this deep cause. It could be
Hmm.
trauma, but it could be just other stuff. Like maybe just like certain, yeah, like say like a mental illness or something. So it's like maybe the best way to handle this isn't necessarily, yeah, beating them up
I
and
guess
throwing them
that
in prison.
I guess that all kind of ties back to your that first paper about the memory authenticity and alienation.
Sure, yeah,
Because with people who have experienced trauma and then became an addict, are they being their authentic self by becoming an addict? Or even if they were to be able to alter the memories from when they experienced this trauma, would they then return to their authentic self by getting rid of the trauma, or are they authentic by already having the trauma?
yeah, no, yeah, exactly. And that's one of the reasons why, especially when I wrote that paper, I was like trying to be very much aware of this kind of, yeah, of this notion of authenticity, because it's like I don't know if that is the best thing to be, yeah, I don't know if that's always the best solution to be appealing to authenticity in this case. It's like maybe especially something like trauma, that can have a very alienating effect, I feel like, on a
Mhm.
person's psyche. So I get, or like the way they relate to the world, the way they like have to experience the world after like a traumatic event. And I think that is, yeah, almost exactly why the discussion maybe, or what we should be focusing on, is like what is causing people to like view the world very differently in ways that they maybe do not feel comfortable with. And I think that's exactly like something like trauma, or like dealing with addiction. Just getting rid of the memories or something might be not that doesn't necessarily fix the underlying kind of world perspective that could be causing that.
Yeah, and I was even thinking authenticity. There might be different types of authenticity, and that's why it's just such a confusing
Sure.
topic to deal with. It's kind of that thing that I was saying before we started about the leaves.
Mm-hmm.
Nietzsche's on Truth and Lie in an extra moral sense, when he was
Yeah,
talking about how we name leaves leaves, but they're all different from each other.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Actually, I
That's
think I think
pardon.
I think you're right here. I think you're on point.
It's a well, especially this is with that ismizing Buddha and how there's multiple different types of Buddhism, like the Zen Buddhism and the one in China. I forget what it's called.
Um, there's
But
there's
they're
there's a few different kinds in China. Because Zen Buddhism comes from Chan Buddhism in China. But Chan Buddhism isn't the only kind. There's Mahayana, which is like a tradition from India that's very popular for a lot of China. So you just yeah, there's a lot of different kinds of it, which yeah, it's kind of like the same kind of project that I was kind of doing there was trying to pay attention to the difference. And it's interesting you brought up Nietzsche because Nietzsche's got can't I'm gonna paraphrase this quote. I can't do it off the top of my head, but Nietzsche's got a quote for it's like um, you're always seeing you're looking with weak eyes if you always see similarities. That like
Hmm.
it requires a degree of like attention and a carefulness to actually like kind of be able to see these differences because that's like what's kind of the real meat of what's going on. And I think it's kind of almost what you're doing with the question of authenticity here because I do think that like just assuming all these different states are like the same or could be grouped into the same is maybe not the best way to handle authenticity. Um, because there could be very various ways of being authentic. And I think and that's the exact kind of project I was trying to do in that Ismizing Buddha one as well. Because I feel like in a lot of especially Western discourse about Buddhism, people just assume Buddhism is a holistic same entity. They just like throw Buddhism out there and just pretend it's got this like it's got all the exact same positions and all the exact same beliefs. And I think especially if you like look into the history of Buddhism, and it's so complicated. There's so many different ways of practicing Buddhism, so many different like countries and people that approach Buddhism that it's like it feels almost like you're doing a sort of like linguistic violence there by putting them all together.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what that paper was on. But I think that's the underlying stem there is I think the thing you're pointing out with the Nietzsche was like it's like paying attention to these particularities as well, these differences.
Yeah, I guess in that sense, language kind of traps you in this box sometimes,
Mm,
and it's hard to get out.
for sure. I think that's kind of and it's almost a kind of a way language I feel like necessarily functions, right? So when we talk about so we like I got a pen here, I got another pen there, and they these like this kind of generic shape or whatever. I can see these multiple objects, and I can all kind of categorize them as a pen, and then
Hmm.
this kind of concept that I've categorized all these different things with, I can then just lump them all together into this one term, and then throw that word to you, and then you've got pen, and then you can start build a whole like and this kind of pen, or you can be like a pen and a cup, and you can build all these kind of ideas together that represent all these like different genera, right? All these different individual things, and they brings it into a single concept, and then we can play with these concepts and like build these concepts on top of each other. When in actuality, they were always in reference to all these like very disparate objects. And I think it's like kind of the way language functions. It kind of lets us do that. It lets us kind of like, yeah, almost build this like shopping basket worth of like ideas that just get. But in actuality, they all represent millions and millions of different things that we've kind of abstracted together into these like very simplified forms. And I think that can also it really quickly causes us trouble. I feel like just like in everyday life and philosophically as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think as time goes on, though, I think the box kind of gets bigger, as in, I think we're able to describe things better over time.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, maybe to some extent, but I can think about ways in which maybe there's certain differences we lose too. Um,
Yeah, or it makes it worse, I guess.
so like I remember I did the Camino de Santiago in Spain where you're like walking through it's a pilgrimage in
Hmm.
Spain, a lot of like old ruins from like I guess like the Celtic people there, and then later the later population where they did a lot of like stone building where they'd build
Hmm.
up these like, churches or walls out of all these little rocks. And I just that image always really sticks to me. Where this like, oh, this is like a building from let's say like the ninth century. I think it's one of the churches I saw. It's like from the ninth century. It's like, but it's just built from rocks, no mortar, no nothing. Right? They just knew how these rocks work so well they could build a whole church from it. And I'm looking at this, and it's like you got to think about like people back then are and I think this is something we like easy to forget today. People back then like knew just as much as we know. they just know it about different things. If you
Hmm.
spend your whole life looking at rocks and messing with rocks, you could do some like mind blowing things with just rocks because you know all these like unique kind of differences that exist in the rocks. And I
Yeah.
couldn't tell you. I mean, there's probably definitely geologists around that can point out a lot of differences, but it's like just the way of like knowing the kind of rock that's able to build in that kind of way is a very different kind of knowledge than being able to categorize. I feel like rock types even.
Yeah, it's kind of, I mean, that kind of relates to, I mean, the pyramids being built. I mean, we question
Sure.
all the time, oh, how are they built? You know, was
Yeah.
it aliens or like, how was it, you know?
Yeah.
But in reality, these people just knew a lot more about how to move heavy rocks.
Yeah. And just yeah, and that kind of stuff. I feel like there's just a lot of that kind of embedded knowledge that was for that kind of specific time period that maybe wouldn't even be all that useful for us in certain extents today, but it's like because they're so experienced with it. I mean, you've got like guys. Just imagine like all the smartest people in our whole country were like focused. I mean, in Egypt's a big country too, especially back then. It's like all the smartest people were focused on building these like massive, you know, buildings. Like they could come up with some crazy ways of being able to do that stuff, and pretty
Yeah.
precise. Like, yeah. So
Yeah,
I
I would love to go back and see it.
yeah. Well, it's like one of the ones that always sticks with me is like I went to this museum in Amarillo, and it was like this. It was about like the Native American tribe there, and I don't remember what tribe it was. And it was like in the museum, it was like, okay, and this is how we think they would have sharpened the rocks, but we're unable to get the rocks as sharp as the tribes that once lived here were able to through whatever their mechanism is. It's like
Wow.
we don't know how they did it. They did it somehow. This is what we assume the method was. We can't replicate it. But it's like I can imagine if I'd spent a long time like just practicing, getting really good at sharpening rocks. I mean, yeah, that's like a whole form of knowledge that like yeah is almost kind of inaccessible to us.
Yeah, because they could have just generation after generation of just manipulating and changing and perfecting the way that they sharpen their rocks or build their pyramids or make the Easter Island heads or
Yeah,
just
yeah,
whatever
oh,
it
yeah.
is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. So that's I think that's one of the just so it's like that's why I'm always skeptical about the time thing, right? Because it's like yeah, there's like no one no one in any period of history is going to be able to like outcompete some like dude that took like a basic computer science class on how computers work, right? No one in any other time period is going to be able to understand that. But that's something that's specific kind of to our almost historical context. So that's like something like
Mhm.
the rocks were to them. It's something very important to us. The same way, it's like we might like it's necessarily it's not necessarily a discussion about degrees of who knows more. It's just we know more about very different kind of things. I feel like in certain ways.
Yeah, and I think that too evolves the way that we use language as well.
For sure, yeah.
I mean, the word computer, uh, I think it was people you were the first computers. They were actually called computers,
Oh, really?
right? And yeah, they were called computers. These people that would
Yeah.
basically just do like mathematical calculations in a
Uh-huh.
room and just determine a bunch of different things, right?
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
eventually we made the actual computer.
Yeah, that would make sense with the compute. Yeah. Oh, interesting. Yeah. So then that I think yeah, it's exactly kind of what we were just discussing, like over time, over history. How these words kind of change, and then like the kind of meaning for them too. Because now I feel like if we're calling a person a computer, I feel like that'd be really disrespectful. But I don't know. Maybe it's at the time is not that association because now we like have to assume it's going to be a machine. But it's like yeah, maybe not. Huh.
Well, you'd have to be pretty smart to be a computer. I'll tell you
Yeah,
that.
for sure. Yeah, you were doing like some crazy math. Right off the top of the bat, right? Yeah, that would be. See, like at the same time, maybe yeah, maybe it's a turn of respect. Then.
So, do you think language, in a sense, can alienate you from reality?
Hmm. Oh, that's an interesting question. Huh. Um, I feel like the question, I don't know, because it's like, to what extent is the reality kind of already a degree of construction of the language, right? Is like the
Hmm.
way we've kind of already like spatialized the, like, I'm just thinking it's like, if I go for a walk in the woods, I already kind of categorize my environment by based on my language: rocks, trees, path, water, right?
Yeah.
And so like I've kind of already built myself this like world I'm existing with, almost through my language. So I don't know. I don't. It would be hard for me to think about a way of being in the world that doesn't kind of necessitate this kind of symbolic web I've already kind of placed on it.
Yeah, without language, it would be a very weird world.
Yeah, I feel like in certain ways it is. I feel like, especially like the Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi, there's definitely some questions there about like kind of how to get to this like a pre-linguistic or non-linguistic world. Um, but it, I feel like it's a very hard thing to do. Especially it's like, you know how much language is important, even conveying the ideas about it. Like, we can't even talk about like a world without like being in language. Um,
Yeah, because then we'd have to talk about it.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, there might, I guess we could get you can imagine a very sophisticated comic book, and a very quick, comic book artist, and able to kind of sketch out a whole cartoon of like what I want to talk about without a language. But I feel like even in that case, it's still like this kind of symbolic way of describing it. That's
Mm.
very much a necessary, almost a necessary part. It seems like, of the human
So I
experience.
guess more so, it's a world without symbols, not a world without language.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And this is something I always, yeah, kind of push for, because I do think there's a lot where like I think that the language does bleed into the symbols a lot too, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it's all symbolic. I guess. I mean, math is symbolic. I mean, we
Yeah,
represent values with numbers or
sure.
even letters if it's a variable,
Yeah,
and it's
definitely.
or even like the crucifix. That's a good example. I mean, that's a symbol, but the crucifix is supposed to represent Jesus Christ, right, and
Hmm.
Christianity. But the crucifix was a execution device, basically.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and this is kind of, yeah. So there's like the discipline, I guess, like semiotics, like the study of signs. And I think this is kind of this, like the crucifix is a good example, because there's like there's different kinds of signs for different kinds of things, right? So you have like certain signs, that seem, when you're discussing them, they seem to directly relate to the object you're kind of discussing. Um, and then there's other ones where it seems like it relates to it, but it has this abundance of kind of meaning where it kind of pulls back in certain ways, like maybe to the older, this is an execution tool, but also to this like new accumulated meaning of like Christianity or whatever. But it can also like start pulling in kind of your own personal feelings about maybe what's going on too. Um, and so I feel like it's like an interesting part. I feel like when you're dealing with symbols, especially like something like that with a cross, or like I think some of these other things, like even like a poison logo, or like just kind of like a stop sign. These kind of things are like so embedded contextually that it's like there's a lot of other associations we have with, I feel like, it's going on in a way that maybe like there's certain other signs that could be more directly correlate. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So why did you want to be a philosopher?
Sorry.
Why did you want to be a philosopher?
Oh, ah, okay. Now you're really hitting me with hard questions. Uh, um, well, I was always interested in thinking about things. I would spend a long time thinking about random things. I remember sitting when I was a kid for a while and did that whole kind of like oh, what if the color I'm seeing is not the same color you're seeing, and we just have the same name for it, right? That kind of
Yeah.
question. I remember I was like 10, and I was like, oh wow, this is mind blowing. Like, think about that forever. I didn't really have a good idea what philosophy was though, because my I had some idea because my parents had studied it. My dad's a professor of theater, and so he taught like Aristotle's Poetics, and like he taught some of the playwrights like Sartre and Camus. So I had
Wow.
some idea who philosophers were. I didn't really understand what it was. I thought I was going to probably go into politics or history. But then my mom's like, "Oh, I really enjoyed philosophy class. You should take one." I was like, "Okay." So I took it and then really liked it, and then kept taking them, and yeah, I was like, "Oh wow," because it also I already really like thinking about things, but I was never really. I've always been very interdisciplinary. Like I really don't like having to focus on one topic the whole time. And a philosophy kind of
Yeah.
yeah, philosophy is very theoretical. So in such a way as it kind of lets you like theorize about the various ways things are interacting. And I think that was very well suited to kind of what I wanted to do.
Yeah, I think in one of your papers it said that philosophy was the science of reason.
Hmm.
And
Oh, interesting.
it's very interesting to me because I mean philosophy is really the basis of all knowledge. I mean, you get a PhD and it stands for Doctor of Philosophy, right? And
Yeah.
it's just I mean it's fun to think about things.
Oh, for sure. I do think it has that kind of dimension, right? Because it was like, especially if you're looking at like the 18th century, um, all science was natural philosophy. Um, kind of everything, like it's coming out of that. It's coming kind of out of the philosophical tradition. Um, the way I kind of like to think about it, though, is it's like philosophy is kind of like it might be the primogenitor or whatever, but like once you kind of solidify what your methodology and your rules are in your area you're kind of trying to think about, then you can kind of leave philosophy and do your own thing. Um,
Yeah.
but I feel like it's very much so. It's like it's what's left when you're kind of just thinking for the sake of thinking. Um, then you can develop like you can see with the origins of like certain sciences. You can start to like origin linguistics with like Saussure or like with Chomsky or something. Then they start thinking about it. They formulate what a paradigm is that they want to be like thinking about or researching, and then they move on from philosophy. I think or like Galileo with like physics, where it's like okay, maybe Aristotle was wrong about some of this stuff. Okay, maybe this is the way we need to start thinking about it.
Yeah, I
So
guess you kind of start with a question and then you structure it after that.
yeah, yeah, for sure. So it's almost like the way I kind of try to think of it, like or like to think about it is almost like philosophy is this kind of unstructured, and then they build plenty of little structures in it. Like you have different, scholasticism or positivism, like the different kind of philosophies that are their own structures. Um, but then you can get people that kind of agree on one and they kind of solidify it, and that becomes another discipline, another kind of way of approaching the world. And then sometimes they kind of pull back to philosophy, or they like pull some ideas from some other places. This
Yeah.
big disciplinary game of learning things.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Stoicism and Eastern philosophy have so much in common as far as that patience and serenity kind of mindset.
Sure.
And it's weird how they're just so far apart, yet they came to the same or at least similar ideas. And I know you went to Hawaii because you're interested in Eastern philosophy, right?
For sure. Yeah, and I think I that okay because then there's like that kind of question of like Huxley's perennial philosophy. It's like it's just every people kind of rethinking the same kind of ideas. But I don't know if I would go with that side of the equation. But I do think your points. You're on to something when you're looking at like Stoicism and Eastern philosophy. But you can look at this with like ethics and Aristotle and Confucius,
Hmm.
or there's Udayana, who's like an Indian logician. He develops some logic. He almost has a Russell's paradox like 1,000 years before Bertrand Russell. Uh, so it's all sorts of these kind of like similarities that go across. But what I think is kind of I think one of the aspects of this is kind of just that, yeah, that we're people. We kind of like think about, we tend to think about the same things. We kind of tend to react to things
Mm-hmm.
the same way. I think so. I think part of the similarity between a lot of the different philosophies kind of almost comes from this like a shared human experience almost. Um, and then I think one of the interesting facts is like then why are they so different oftentimes? And I think that's kind of where this kind of fascinating question comes in. Kind of almost like what we were discussing before. I think that, so why is Aristotle's, why is Aristotle's ethics, why does it not really seem to take account, it takes into account the polis and stuff, but it seems very focused on like a city almost, and like an individual's interactions, where like kind of Confucian ethics, you're dealing with, how to be a gentleman in relation to, like your family, this your city, but your province, your like whole country, you're the emperor, and then like almost the universe. So it kind of almost builds up in this way that seems very alien to the to like the Aristotelian ethics. And I think the same thing you see happen with like, some of the way like some of the Taoists would approach certain ways of like being versus like the Stoics. It's like they both seem to like emphasize this like self control in relation to a kind of tumultuous environment, right? But a lot of the metaphors, the way like the Stoics, I feel like are describing it, tends to be like very focused almost on kind of on a self in a way where it's like, I think oftentimes with Taoism you see it's like it's almost like focused on a non-self. It's a focus on trying to like put yourself in the place of a kind of environment that's like moving alongside you and how to best flow with that. Um, and I think that's where stuff that kind of ends up pretty interesting. One of the things that always really sticks with me for like that, for like history ideas in general, is like why was China and Greece so good at history, in like India, in India you don't have any really good historians for like centuries until a lot of like the Islam incursion later. And so it's like, so why India had clearly this advanced science. I mean, they're the ones that come up with like the number zero pretty early on. The number system we still use in mathematics is like from India. So why do they have all these advancements in all sorts of areas of science? They don't seem to care about history. And then vice versa, you look at Greece, it's like, okay, so Greece, some great historians, Thucydides, Herodotus, lesser extent Xenophon, but like, why is Greece so, Greece is really good at history, but like logic and like, I mean, we like to pretend logic is huge, but it's like, I don't know. Aristotle's the only one that seems to be really formulating a good logic here, at least until the Stoics. The Stoics really going on their own. But like before that, it's like, I feel like we're kind of just dealing with, honestly, it's mathematics is okay, but logic, I feel like we're kind of just dealing with Aristotle. Um, but like vice versa, India as a whole, with the Nyaya, a whole long logical tradition for like centuries of like really complex logicians. And I think that's kind of like one of the ways to look at it. I mean, something with history can make some sense. If you're constantly in a state of war with your neighboring city states, it's kind of important to record which battles you won, which battles you lost. So that kind of maybe insane. I feel like similar things going on with the different states in China. So that kind of explains, I mean, potentially in some extent, maybe why history is so important for the Greeks and the Chinese, and way less important for the Indians. But some of these other ones, it's like logic is an interesting one. It's like, why would they develop that? I don't know.
Do you think um, cultural ego has anything to do with that? Because I know Hinduism is very non-egotistical, whereas um, I don't want to stereotype uh, Athens and Sparta, but they were definitely pretty into themselves.
I think that might be an important aspect for sure. So, yeah, undoubtedly the Athenians are very into themselves. But yeah, and I think one of the other things I thought about, and I haven't studied a whole lot of Greek or Sanskrit, but one of the things about Sanskrit, pretty early on, which is so important for like especially a lot of all the classic Indian texts, is that it has a very interesting, very kind of complex grammar. And because you have these old texts that are so important to kind of analyze, um, that I feel like that's one of the reasons why you end up with a very complicated early on grammar system. I mean, like even Chomsky with his with his syntactic structures in like the 20th century. He's like, yeah, Panini in like ancient India. This is basically the same thing. It's like so this is like this revolutionary change in linguistics in the 20th century. He's like, yeah, but like the Indians also did the same thing in like classic India, and I think maybe part of that's the language they have, and I think like the religion I think can also be pretty important, because it's like for a lot of like the Greeks, like the questions of like, especially since there isn't really religion to the same extent around anymore, in like the kind of Hellenistic kind of faith. But it is interesting to think about to what extent that plays, because a lot of the god. I mean, like if you look at a lot of the myths about like Zeus, um, he seems to be always out for himself,
Yeah.
and so that does play with it into it with a certain extent. Um, Maybe that's in certain ways why you want to move in one direction or another.
And you bring up that thing about Zeus, and it makes me think about how a lot of the Western gods are people.
Oh, sure.
Whereas this, I guess, I mean, the Hindu gods aren't, I mean, some of them are kind of people, but they're definitely very morphed. Or at least there's, what's his name? Ari Krishna. I think he's this
Krishna?
almost this
Yeah,
multi armed giant, like,
right.
god, right?
I think some of I think for especially with the like, Indian religion though, I feel like some of the what makes them seem very like different for us is honestly like almost like a symbolic way of representing things. So
Hmm.
like for a lot of them, more arms was seen like you could do more things. So that's why I
Mm.
feel like a lot of the Indian gods would be presented with a lot more arms. For example, the same reason they're presented as blue a lot of times, because it was like it had a, like symbolism for like this kind of like vast depth and vast ocean. Um,
Mm.
and so that's why like you look at Vishnu, but a lot of the ways like Vishnu would incarnate with like with Krishna, Rama, and then they're also blue, and it's kind of this interesting kind of parallel. It's got this deep symbolism. Same way the reason why Shiva's like ash white, because it's got this kind of symbolism
Mm.
like destruction as well. And that's why like a lot of the Shivites would like paint themselves in like the ash white, to also kind of like connect with that. So it, they are people, but I mean like it also is kind of complicated because there is like the way in this in Hinduism itself is immensely complicated, but there's this way in which theologically they're also supposed to be all this like if especially if we're taking like a Advaita Vedanta position, they're all the same being kind of experiencing itself in the universe, right? So if we're taking
Mm.
that kind of broad picture, the distinctions don't necessarily always matter either. It's like if I bleed into you or you bleed into me, if we're all kind of the same thing anyway, um, then I think
Mm.
that also is part of it. So yeah, I don't know, and I do think that it is important to like I think for a lot of the Western thought, especially the Greeks, I think a lot of it came from the Egyptians too, and I think a lot of their gods are a very close association with a lot of animals. And I mean,
Mm.
and Zeus also, when Zeus is on some of his escapades, I know he turns into like an ox or a swan or
Huh.
stuff.
Or
So
like I think it turned into an eagle at some point.
yeah, for
I
sure.
don't
Yeah, he's a Zeus is no offense. I think Zeus can be a bit of a weirdo sometimes.
remember. So so what's phenomenology?
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, because I think I mentioned that before as well. So phenomenology kind of
Phenomenology.
yeah, it's fine. It's like it's kind of like a philosophical discipline from the late 19th century, early 20th century, and it really starts. And there's just the debates about this, but it really starts kind of with Edmund Husserl, who's a German mathematician. But he was like kind of got really interested in kind of where kind of this mathematics is kind of coming from, and so he wants to build this kind of a philosophy he thinks that can be a foundation for everything else. Kind of almost
Hmm.
going back to what we were discussing earlier, like how can I rest? Like how can I make a form of knowledge that all the rest of the forms of knowledge can be sure of, that there can be like trust in, right?
Hmm.
And so he wanted to build that from like direct experience, the experience I'm having of kind of the world going on. And so the one of the reasons he did this, and he was really into Descartes, and he had this idea, and he likes Descartes' like methodological doubt, um, where like Descartes, at the beginning of the Cartesian meditations, is like, oh, I am, I want to make sure I'm sure of everything, so I'm going to pretend I don't know anything. What can I start with? And then Descartes like, oh, the first thing I can't question is I think, and so therefore I know I am. And so like Husserl doesn't
Hmm.
want to go into that like the I think therefore I am thing, but he does want to say it's like, okay, the first thing we can't really question is how we're experiencing the world. And so like that's something I can begin with. And he calls this thing like epoche, this bracketing of experience in the world. And so I'm going to bracket what I already know and kind of start from this direct experience. And so that's kind of what phenomenology as a discipline ends up being. It's looking at the different phenomena you're kind of experiencing and trying to categorize that and try to like come up with a kind of whole explanation or whole just really like a nuanced description of kind of what directly you're experiencing and what
Hmm.
you're so you're able to kind of convey it to other people. And then he wanted to do it so he could do it rigorously as like as a science, in which he could build all the other sciences off of. Heidegger was also a phenomenologist. Heidegger could be done in the kind of way Husserl wanted it to, and Heidegger was a student. Heidegger goes off in his own direction, um, where he's got this whole. One of the Heidegger's big differences is like, okay, but you're positing the self that's experiencing the world, but you still have this like subject-object division.
Yeah.
Um, and so like that's kind of I feel like a lot of like Heidegger's project is to try to deal with that kind of issue.
Hmm.
But that's kind of in a nutshell what phenomenology is. This kind of like this direct experience. If you want to go into like almost analytic philosophy of mind, it's almost like this like categorizing the qualia of what's going on.
Hmm. I guess that's almost similar to naming things in general.
Sure. And then I think that's like, especially with Heidegger, that ends up becoming an important part of like dealing with the language of what's going on. But I think it's like, it is kind of like the naming things. Part of it was like Husserl wanted to like, okay, bracket out all the kind of these kind of conceptions that we're kind of always dealing with, like not just language, but like these cultural conceptions about how we see this thing, and just like look at this glass or look at this table, and it's like, okay, so I can kind of see it's like it seems to move down at this like angle. If I walk around it, it seems to be like it's still circular in certain ways, and just like a really the dude was like very very into like trying to be as precise as possible for how he could just like describe what his experience was that he's having about whatever thing. But yeah, it's kind of it's that trying to just he was trying to make it like a science. Other people like Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, or Heidegger. It's like I don't know how if this is we can really build all science off of this. Um,
Yeah.
but it has become a genuine question though, right? Because it's like you do, or at least this ends up being, and this is one of the things that Husserl was really dealing with, especially with his questions of like, um, I said Cartesian meditations earlier. That's one of his later books, but it's like this: how do I deal with this kind of like the crisis of the European sciences is one of his other
Hmm.
books. It's like how do I deal with like what are we all agreeing? We got to come up with some sort of base that we're kind of all agreeing on because it seems like a lot of like empiricism, for example, right? A lot of like that seems like a base position. A lot of science, it doesn't necessarily seem as metaphysically tenable as we would like to like think it is. And so that's part of the thing is he's trying to deal with the questions of empiricism and idealism and what is this? What can what can we all agree on to kind of build science from here without just taking this like metaphysical assumptions about reality in the world?
Yeah, it's kind of like how can we all be on the same page and then start writing from there,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, for sure. Yeah. But as it kind of evolves as a tradition, it really becomes kind of a philosophy focused on the person's own experience,
Hmm.
and how they like how that impacts the situation. So I ends up having a lot of, I think, it ends interesting, like kind of philosophical tradition. Some people's like, like almost with Fanon and dealing with like racism in North Africa, or like sometimes later like thinkers with like what is it like to experience someone to look at you as like a different race, as something
Hmm.
like Fanon dealing with, or like this becomes important for like uh, critical disability studies or something, where it's like what is it like to like be in a world when you maybe don't have the same number of arms, the same number of legs as everybody else.
Yeah. It'd definitely be a much stranger world.
Yeah, yeah, and that's kind of like that's kind of the thing I think phenomenology can also inform, is like what it's like to be embodied, and trying to describe that
Hmm.
for other people in a way that like is also understandable. Because I feel like it's kind of, it's almost getting into what we were kind of discussing earlier with that with the language, like how much things are understandable. It's like it might take, what for me is like I can feel in like 10 seconds, might take me a whole book to describe to you, but like we can kind of get across in this shared meaning of like, so I can appreciate, maybe how the world is for you, and then you can maybe
Yeah.
appreciate how the world is for me.
Hmm. All right. Well, I think we can end it there.
Yeah, all right, sure, sounds good to me.
Cool.
Thanks for having me on, dude.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
And then for all those out there that, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, just email into.the.absurd.podcast@gmail.com. All right. That's it. Thanks for listening.